Why do powerful countries so often ignore international law? Why do leaders on the world stage often say one thing and then do another? Why do states that champion human rights still arm authoritarian regimes? If you've ever watched international events unfold and thought, this doesn't feel right, you're not alone. Classical realism offers one of the oldest and most enduring explanations for this apparent contradiction. In global politics, power, not ideals, calls the shots. Classical realism is one of the oldest foundational theories of international relations. It's the framework that starts with a sobering assumption that politics, especially international politics, is shaped by power, insecurity, and self-interest. Realism doesn't promise peace or progress. It doesn't start with how the world ought to be. It argues it starts with how the world is and always has been. So in this video, we're going to explore the roots of classical realism, examine its key assumptions, and look at how it shapes international politics today. But let's start by going back, way back, to the origins of realism and its central insight that power and survival often matter more than ideals. The roots of realism stretch back over 2,000 years to thinkers across both Western and non-Western traditions who tried to make sense of a world they framed as driven by power, insecurity, and the quest for survival. In ancient Greece, the general and historian Thucydides chronicled the war between the city-states of Athens and Sparta. In what is often described as the first work of political realism, his History of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides writes of Athenians' justification for attacking the neutral island of Melos, describing the Athenian negotiators' rejection of Melian calls for justice, stating, "Right as the world goes is only in question between equals. While the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must." For Thucydides, international politics was governed not by morality, but by necessity, fear, and power. In his view, the Athenian assertion that, in the absence of equal power, the strong will act as they see fit and the weak will be forced to endure the consequences, captured the nature of an international order where power was the driving dynamic. Thucydides saw human nature, ambition, honor, fear, and so on, as the key drivers of conflict. As a result, leaders must understand the dangers of trusting in ideals when the survival of the state is at stake. A millennium later, Niccolò Machiavelli offered a similar but perhaps even more cynical view. Writing during the turmoil of Renaissance Italy, Machiavelli's The Prince advised rulers to be ruthless and pragmatic. You must know that there are two ways of contesting, one by the law, the other by force. If the first method is proper to men, the second to beasts. But because the first is frequently not sufficient, it is necessary to have recourse to the second. He continues even more starkly. Here, a question arises, whether it is better to be loved than feared or the reverse. The answer is, of course, that it would be best to be both loved and feared. But since the two rarely come together, anyone compelled to choose will find greater security in being feared than in being loved. Love endures by a bond which men, being scoundrels, may break whenever it serves their advantage to do so. But fear is supported by the dread of pain which is ever present. For Machiavelli, then, effective leadership meant using power wisely, even deceitfully, if it meant preserving the state. He didn't glorify cruelty, but he saw politics as a realm distinct from ethics. And in that realm of politics, outcomes matter more than intentions. Building on this tradition, the British political philosopher Thomas Hobbes imagined a state of nature where no centralized authority exists, an idea that resonates strongly with realism's anarchic view of the international system. In Leviathan, Hobbes famously describes this state of nature as a war of all against all, where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In other words, for Hobbes, individuals, and by analogy states, living in an anarchic world are driven by fear and the desire for self-preservation. Without a powerful sovereign to keep order, conflict is inevitable, creating an international system defined by anarchy, insecurity, and self-help. In the aftermath of World War II, Hans Morgenthau brought these classical ideas into the modern era. In Politics Among Nations, he outlined the core tenets of what we now describe as political realism. In broad terms, Morgenthau maintained that the statesman must think in terms of the national interest, conceived as power among other powers. The popular mind, unaware of the fine distinctions of the statesman's thinking, reasons more often than not in the simple moralistic and legal terms of absolute good and evil. In this vein, Morgenthau outlines his 6 tenets of political realism. First, politics is governed by objective laws rooted in human nature. That is, we can develop scientific understandings of politics based on our understandings of human nature. And importantly, human nature is viewed through a pessimistic lens. As a species, we're self-centered, self-regarding, and self-interested. Second, the national interest of the state is defined in terms of power. States will always try to secure their goals, which can be understood in terms of power. In Morgenthau's view, this helps us avoid fallacious concerns with motives, moralities, or ideological preferences. Next, interests are dynamic. While the national interest is always defined in terms of power, the nature and scope of that interest is dynamic and changing. As a result, abstract moral principles cannot be applied to politics. While morals may be important, they can't be applied in an abstract or universalistic manner to international politics. Morals do not determine the actions of states, though they may be a source of some influence. Morality, in other words, must be filtered through concrete circumstances. And there's a difference between moral aspirations that may help motivate a state and universal moral principles. While states may attempt to shroud their own interests in a cloak of universalistic moral claims, Morgenthau maintains that this is misleading and pernicious, cloaking power interests in moral language. In reality, states are simply making moral claims to advance their true interest, power. And finally, the international sphere is autonomous and distinct from the domestic sphere. While we may engage in legalistic or moralistic arguments in domestic politics, there's no room for such debates in international politics. Morgenthau, in other words, emphasized power and prudence, urging analysts to think politically, not morally. He saw international politics as a struggle among states, driven by the same impulses that governed the actions of Thucydides' generals and Machiavelli's princes. Interestingly, and although often overlooked, classical realist ideas also emerged outside the West. In the 5th century BCE, the Chinese philosopher Mozi critiqued the wastefulness of war and advocated for universal love, a concept not traditionally realist. But he nevertheless acknowledged the dangers of fragmented society that lacked shared norms and authority. In this sense, his analysis of pre-state chaos parallels realist concerns with anarchy in a way that foreshadows Hobbes's work. Indeed, writing during the Warring States period, Mozi argues that, in ancient times, when people were first born and did not yet have any form of government, there was a saying, people differ regarding their ideal sense of what is right. So, one person had one idea, 2 people had 2, 10 had 10. The more numerous the people, the more conflicting their ideas. So people affirmed their own ideals and refuted those of others. Thus, when interacting, they opposed one another. Within the home, resentments and hatreds arose between father and child, elder and younger, and once separated, they were unable to reconcile harmoniously. Ordinary people throughout the world used water, fire, and poisons to harm one another, and wouldn't help one another out if they had the strength to spare. In fact, they would even prefer surplus goods to rot rather than share them. The way of virtue was hidden, not shared between them. The chaos in the world was beastly. This sentiment is closely aligned, even if predating by almost 2,000 years, the ideas of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke that would eventually become the social contract theory of government. Around a century later, the Indian philosopher Kautilya, who's sometimes referred to as India's Machiavelli, wrote on the importance of espionage, realpolitik, and the use of alliances and force to maintain power and state security. Indeed, like Machiavelli, Kautilya famously advised rulers to act with ends in mind, arguing that the king's welfare lies in the welfare of his subjects, hence he shall protect them by all means. And around the same time, legalist thinkers like Han Feizi argued for centralized power and the need to rule through fear, ideas later adopted by Qin dynasty rulers unifying China. While focused primarily on domestic politics, Han nevertheless maintained a view of human nature rooted in self-interest and asserted that rulers must govern based on clearly defined laws, consistent rewards and punishment, and strong central authority rather than on moral persuasion and virtue. As he wrote, the enlightened ruler guides and controls his ministers by means of 2 handles alone. Those handles are punishment and reward. These non-Western traditions illustrate that the logic of power, fear, and survival has deep roots across civilizations. So, while we can identify some differences in focus between various realist thinkers we've looked at so far, we can nevertheless also identify a common set of foundational ideas, assumptions about human nature, the nature of the international system, and motivations for states that unify classical realism as a theoretical lens for analyzing global politics. First, classical realists begin with a rather pessimistic view of human nature. Drawing on thinkers like Thucydides, Machiavelli, and Hobbes, they argue that people are inherently self-interested, driven by a desire for power, security, and survival. And because states are made up of people, these same impulses shape how states behave. Hans Morgenthau put it bluntly when he concluded that political realism believes that politics, like society in general, is governed by objective laws that have their roots in human nature. In other words, conflict and competition aren't accidents or misunderstandings, they're natural outcomes of who we are. Realists also contend that the international system lacks a central authority. There is no world government to enforce laws or protect states from aggression. This condition, what scholars call anarchy, doesn't mean chaos, but rather the absence of a higher power above states. Because of this, each state must rely on itself for survival. As Hobbes might put it, they exist in a state of nature where security is never guaranteed and trust is always provisional. Third, classical realism sees states as the most important actors in world politics. While other actors, like international organizations, non-governmental organizations, or even individuals, may play a role, state behavior and action is the key to understanding global politics. Further, realists view the state as a rational and unitary actor. That is, realists treat the state as if it acts with a single set of interests and goals, usually defined in terms of power and security. As a result, the motives of leaders and the influence of public opinion are less important than the state's need to survive in a dangerous world. For realists, the central goal of every state is to ensure its own survival, and to do that, states must seek power. Power becomes the currency of international politics, the means by which states pursue their interests and protect themselves. This doesn't mean that states are always aggressive or expansionist, but it does mean that even peaceful states must be prepared to defend themselves. As Morgenthau famously argued, the concept of interest defined in terms of power imposes intellectual discipline upon the observer. It eliminates the biases and preconceptions of ideology or morality. That's not to say that classical realists reject morality, but they're deeply skeptical about applying moral principles to state behavior. In the realist view, the state must often choose between acting morally and acting prudently. And where morality is evoked in international politics, it's often used as a cynical tool of power projection rather than as an actual claim of moral rightness. Indeed, Morgenthau famously warned against what he called the moralizing approach to international politics, using abstract moral ideals to justify state actions. For realists, the key question is not, is this policy good, but rather, is it effective in advancing the national interest? Or, as Thucydides showed in the Melian dialogue, realists believe that when power is at stake, appeals to justice may fall on deaf ears. Together, these assumptions form the backbone of classical realism, a theory grounded in sober analysis of power, a deep skepticism towards idealism, and a sharp focus on state interest in a dangerous world. In the realist worldview, peace is always provisional, and security is never guaranteed. As a result, prudence, preparation, and power are essential. Despite being rooted in ancient Greek philosophy and post-war scholarship, the realist worldview continues to shape how policymakers and analysts understand international politics. In fact, if you've ever heard a political leader talk about the national interest, deterrence, or balance of power, chances are they were channeling realist ideas, whether they realized it or not. Take the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. While the official rationale often included spreading democracy and responding to terrorism, many realists argued that the deeper motivation was rooted in power and security. After 9/11, the U.S. perceived Iraq under Saddam Hussein as a potential threat to strategic dominance in the Middle East. From the realist perspective, this could be seen as a classic example of a state acting to secure its interests in an uncertain and potentially hostile environment. Whether or not that threat was real, the logic of preemptive action fits within realist thinking. Better to act now than to wait and be vulnerable. But this also illustrates what realists call the security dilemma, when one state's efforts to increase its own security, like the US invading Iraq, are perceived as threats by others, like Iran, prompting them to respond in kind and unintentionally escalating regional instability. We can also see realism playing out in the growing strategic rivalry between the United States and China. As China's economic and military power expands, many in Washington worry about a shift in the global balance of power. Realists argue that power transitions are dangerous moments in history. Rising powers want more influence, established powers fear decline. This dynamic, sometimes called the Thucydides trap, raises the risk of confrontation as each side acts to defend what it sees as its vital national interests. For realists, this isn't about values or political systems, it's about structural pressures in an anarchic world. Both sides are acting rationally in response to the other's rise. Whether conflict happens depends on how well they manage that competition within a realist framework. Another example is Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. While many analysts focus on ideological or domestic factors, realists emphasize Russia's concern with NATO expansion and its desire to reassert influence over its near abroad. Through a classical realist lens, Russia is acting to restore a favorable balance of power in its region, seeking security, prestige, and strategic depth in a world it sees as threatening and zero-sum. Likewise, the West's response, sanctions, armed shipments, and diplomatic isolation, reflect realist concerns about deterrence and alliance credibility. Ultimately, classical realism remains relevant because it offers a sobering lens through which we can understand international politics. It doesn't promise perpetual peace or moral progress. Instead, it asks us to confront the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. Realism reminds us that behind every grand ideal or moral justification, there are calculations of power, interest, and survival. And while it may not explain everything, especially in a world shaped by economics, institutions, and non-state actors, it continues to offer powerful insights into why states behave the way they do. Indeed, if as you follow current events, you ask yourself, what would a realist say about this? What are the power dynamics at play? Whose interests are being defended? Chances are you'll start to see realism not just as a theory, but as a mindset, and one that's alive and well in global politics today. While realism offers a powerful and enduring lens for understanding international politics, it's far from universally accepted. Scholars, students, and policymakers have raised a number of important critiques that challenge its assumptions, its worldviews, and its ability to explain some key features in the international system. One of the most frequent criticisms is that classical realism sees the world as too conflict-prone, too cynical, and too focused on power. By assuming that states are locked in constant struggle for survival, realists often neglect the possibility of cooperation, trust-building, and peaceful resolution of disputes. Critics point out that the modern international system includes a vast web of international institutions, like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, regional alliances, and so on, all of which facilitate cooperation and reduce the likelihood of war. If states were only ever self-interested power seekers, why would they bother creating or sustaining these institutions anyway? Critics also maintain that classical realism's focus on the state is myopic. In today's world, many of the most pressing issues, climate change, terrorism, pandemics, global inequality, and so on, can't be solved by any one state acting alone. These are transnational challenges that require multilateral cooperation and the investment and involvement of non-state actors like NGOs, multinational corporations, and international organizations. According to its critics, realism fails to explain how and why these actors influence global politics, or why states sometimes subordinate short-term power interests to broader collective goals. Another critique is that realism relies on very specific and arguably outdated views of human nature. It argues that humans, and by extension states, are hardwired to seek power and to act in self-interest. But feminist and constructivist scholars argue that this view is gendered, culturally specific, and socially constructed. Feminist IR theorists, for example, point out that the traits realism associates with strong leadership, like dominance, control, and aggression, are traditionally coded for masculine, while traits like empathy and cooperation are marginalized. They argue that realism's so-called objectivity masks deeper biases about what counts as rational behavior in global politics. Realism has also struggled to explain certain developments in world politics, like the end of the Cold War without direct military conflict, the European Union's deep integration, or the growing influence of global norms like human rights and environmental protection. These phenomena suggest that ideas, identities, and institutions matter at least as much as power in the contemporary global system. In response, some realists have adapted their theories, like neo-realists or neoclassical realists.
But classical realism, with its focus on human nature and state power, still faces these limitations. Finally, critics argue that realism's insistence on separating politics from morality leaves little room for normative concerns. Realists often caution against moralizing international politics, but that doesn't mean that justice, fairness, or human rights are unimportant. By bracketing out moral questions, its critics argue that realism risks legitimating a status quo that benefits powerful states while marginalizing weaker ones. For its critics, realism may help explain how the world works, but it struggles answering how it ought to work. Or, as R.B.J. Walker put it even more forcefully, contending that realism is little more than an anti-political apology for cynicism and physical force, conflating power with legitimacy and potentially justifying the status quo without critical examination. In short, classical realism offers sharp tools for analyzing power, interests, and conflict, but that's not the whole picture. Understanding its limitations is essential, not to reject it outright, but to recognize where it falls short and where other theories might pick up the slack.